Before we start completely, I want to take just a couple minutes to explain how the meeting works. One thing to tell you is that we're recording this meeting, so if we haven't started yet, someone please start recording for us. We're doing that so that we can offer this to people who can't be with us live. We will end the recording after the presentation because we want to spend some time after for getting to know each other, sharing our stories and that kind of thing, and we want to respect your privacy. So we'll be recording, we'll turn that off after the official presentation is done. To answer a question that we just had, actually, you have the option of muting and unmuting yourself and turning your video on and off at your discretion. At the bottom left of your screen, there's a little microphone, and there's another button that looks like a video camera. So that's how you can turn your audio and your video on and off. In the middle, at the bottom, you'll see a chat icon, looks like a little word bubble, and you can put questions and feedback in there. I would encourage you to. At the end of the presentation, we'd love to hear your voice and just have a face-to-face conversation, but sometimes people have a question or a thought that they'd rather not say out loud. So if you would like to, please do put your questions and thoughts in there, any kind of feedback. One thing is that we would recommend that you mute yourselves during the presentation just to reduce background noise, but afterwards, go ahead and unmute and we'll just have a conversation. In the chat, if you're already down there looking at the chat, go ahead and click on that. I have put a few resources in there just to start us off. The first one is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That's a good thing to have for yourself, for a loved one. Just important to know how to access that. I've also put my contact info, my email address, if you want to contact me after this with any questions or you want to be connected to somebody else who was on the call. I put the Everytown Survivor Network website, and we will go into that in detail later. I also put the Moms Demand Action website so you can get to know a little bit about us and what we do, and I put the Pushback Community Alliance Facebook page on there because we are co-hosting this event with them. And I think I did. Yes, I put the Counselors for Change Facebook page on there as well. And then the last thing I would tell you is that we would love to take attendance. So if you have not yet, send Laura Torillo your first and last name. She is on the Zoom, and you can send through the chat, you can send a message just to her. So search for her name, Laura Torillo, send her your first and last name, just so that we know who we've got here.
I got it, Valerie. We're on top of it.
Awesome. Okay. Laura will find you, then I'll put it that way. Okay. So with that, if we want to start with an opening prayer. And I should say that Rochelle Jolly is going to lead us in an opening prayer. She is our faith lead for moms. Thank you, Rochelle.
Okay. Our kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we bow our heads before Thee, ask Thee to please bless this meeting, to please bless those who are suffering with trauma or depression. Please bless each of us that we will follow the example of our Savior, Jesus Christ, that we will reach out to serve and to lift up and to carry those burdens. We ask Thee to please bless us as this organization with Counselors for Change and Moms Demand Action, that we might do Thy will, that we will be able to help to bring peace and joy to our community and to help those who are downtrodden. We love Thee so much and say these things in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you. All right. And today, like Rochelle said, our presentation is about trauma, the effects of trauma, and ways that we can best cope with trauma. And our presentation is being provided by Counselors for Change. Like our local chapter of Moms Demand Action, Counselors for Change started after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting. So we are very like-minded. Counselors for Change is a collaborative, high-impact coalition of passionate mental health professionals, educators, students, parents, community members, and partnering agencies dedicated to improving the mental health of communities through initiatives that focus on awareness, education, advocacy, and outreach. The organization defines a counselor as one who advocates for the well-being of another, empowering each individual with potential to make a positive impact on others. We're joined today by Stephanie Bird, you raise your hand, a licensed marriage and family therapist and the founder of Counselors for Change, and also Tiffany Trudeau, a licensed mental health counselor and founding member of Counselors for Change's board of directors. Both therapists own private practices in Broward County, are active in our community, and are highly trained in trauma-informed approaches to healing. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you, Valerie, and everybody here for inviting us. We're both really grateful to be a part of this collaborative effort. Like you said, Counselors for Change came in the wake of gun violence. I happen to be in DC for a conference that I go to every year where 3,000 to 4,000 therapists convene for workshops around mental health. And it coincided with the March for Our Lives weekend. And so sitting in a ballroom with 3,500 other mental health professionals, it's even when I think about it today, which speaks to trauma, my heart is heavy because I remember that collective grief that everybody felt in the wake of that. And the therapists were talking about, how do we move forward? How do we impact change? And so the wheels were spinning. And then going on the streets of DC to participate in the march, I was able to visually and viscerally feel the impact of trauma on individuals, on the families gathered there, on the communities that flew in, and really on the entire nation. So that whole experience, my wheels got spinning the whole weekend. I was thinking about what I could do. And then I flew back and I'm like, I can't do this alone, and connected with a bunch of other passionate people who put their minds together and created some concrete initiatives and ways to impact change. So we're really excited to be here with you because Moms Demand Action is the very same thing, right? We want to create mentally well, safe communities. So, thank you for having us, everyone. Tiffany and I are going to be sharing some information on trauma today, really at a time when we're sitting in it once again. We're living in the wake or in the midst of COVID-19 and the changes and challenges that brings, but also we're sitting with the awareness of the murder of George Floyd and the many people of color before and after him that have been impacted due to systemic racism. So each of us in some way are feeling some of that today as we sit here. So it's timely that we're covering trauma. We're going to look at how we define it, really just to expand our lens on what that definition is. A lot of times when I'm practicing, I'm always asking that first intake about trauma, and many people say they have no trauma. And I think that is because we have this very narrow definition of it, right? And for some people, the image of trauma is military combat or a plane crash, but it's so much more than that. So we're going to be helping to define and broaden that lens today for everyone. We're going to look at who it impacts and how it impacts people on an individual, but also a systemic level. We have to really understand how all of those systems are interacting to be able to do something about it. We're also going to touch on how early childhood trauma and experiences following it impact overall health and our ability to navigate just the inevitable changes and challenges that life brings. We're going to look at how trauma influences our brain and how we view and navigate the world. We're going to learn about the symptoms, factors of resiliency and resources, and share some support systems. So we're going to be covering a lot, but we're just going to be grazing the surface with covering all of that because it's a really comprehensive topic. But Tiffany and I want you to take away really three main things. One, that expanded definition of trauma. We want everybody to start looking at the world and the people in it, including ourselves, with a more trauma-informed lens. That impacts what questions we ask and the actions we take. And it tends to get us at the table with a more compassionate presence. And we know that compassion will create the change that we really want to make. And then third, we want you to take away some resources for support and action. And that action may be being able to sit and hold a compassionate space for a loved one who's lost someone in their lives. It may be marching to DC and impacting legislative change on a societal level. Anywhere in between, we want to give you the support and resources to improve your life and be able to take some action so that we can all move towards traumatic growth. So with that, bear with me, I'm going to share a screen. think I've got that up. All right, so Peter Levine is, if you read any of his books, he's a great resource in the field of trauma. And he writes, trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. And that's why we really want to increase our awareness and expand that lens. And a couple weeks ago, I was listening to Regina's story. And as soon as she was into the story, the traumatic grief and loss of losing her son, it reminded me of this quote. Tell the story of the mountain you climbed. Your words could become a page in someone else's survival guide. You know, it truly highlights the power of a story. Not only do your words become a page in someone else's survival guide, but by sharing our narrative, it becomes a page in our own survival guide. You know, trauma can be so intense, and the emotional and physical response to it gets humans in a state where they'll do anything to avoid it. And it's really, that is what creates long-term suffering. Because when we experience something traumatic, there are parts and pieces of the experience, and they're stored in a jumbled, fragmented state. By working through our own narrative of that, we create a cohesive narrative that allows us to begin that healing process. So thank you, Regina, for that, for taking part in your own traumatic growth and for fostering it in others. And I know next week, I believe Lachey is going to be sharing her story, correct? And so let's start with how we define trauma. You know, a definition by the National Institute of Mental Health talks about trauma as classified as a stressful or negative experience. Right there, we can expand our lens. And these experiences may include, but they're certainly not limited to, physical or sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, poverty, witnessing distressing events like family or community violence, a natural disaster. There's a whole range of events that create just stressful or negative experiences for us. It's also an experience that involves a perceived threat to well-being or someone close to you. For example, in the wake of the Marjorie Stoneman school shootings, I was seeing a lot of students and parents 3 hours north who were suffering from symptoms of trauma. The parents could relate to the parents and families who've lost, and the students could relate to their peers. And they were exposed repeatedly through social media. And parents were anxious about sending their kids to school. They were checking in frequently with them, texting, considering bulletproof backpacks, and contemplating leaving jobs to homeschool their kids. Students were suffering from panic attacks at school. They had headaches and belly aches and had trouble concentrating. So you can see that it doesn't even have to be something that happens directly to you, but if it's in your sphere, it can deeply impact you. It's also important to look at the fact that trauma is subjective to the person experiencing it. So an example of that would be some objective details. A goldfish dies, right? It's not negatable, it's a goldfish dies. But we have 2 kids who experience that very same event. And you might have one child who cries nightly for weeks, who fears getting another pet, who has intrusive memories about feeding the goldfish and buying the goldfish that are interwoven with an image of the goldfish dying. And yet another child might find out the goldfish dies and kind of shrugs it off, decides a quick burial in the backyard's good enough, and then looks forward to playing with Legos with their sibling a half hour later. So trauma is really subjective to the person experiencing it. And then also trauma can be what happens to us, but also what doesn't happen to us. In cases of neglect, a child or an adult isn't necessarily experiencing physical violence, but they're experiencing the absence of connected love and attunement. In the cases of COVID-related losses, you have families who can't hold the hands of loved ones, who can't honor them in ways that are traditional for their family or culture. And so the absence of those things are also part of the traumatic experience. And then, beyond the definition, we want to look at those interacting systems, because that's really going to expand how we understand trauma. Trauma does not happen in a vacuum any more than racism or discrimination does. It is a collective experience that happens in a larger context. Each part of that system, the individual, the family, the organizations like schools and churches, the community around those organizations and society at large, are all interacting with each other. And so when we can zoom in and see the individual impact and zoom out and see how each of those systems are interacting, it really helps inform us. So, let's say an individual experiences the gun violence related death of a loved one. That may be a suicide, a gun related accident, or a death at the hands of a perpetrator of gun violence. That individual has genetics, the color of their skin, sexual orientation, perhaps a medical condition. Also their lived experiences within their environment. All of those things and others are going to impact the individual. The individual is going to experience the physical, emotional, and behavioral and cognitive impact of that trauma. Their heart may race, they may experience fear or grief, they may avoid school or work, and they may begin to believe that they're not safe, the world is not safe, and that they're powerless, or any other of those negative beliefs that tend to set in when we're in the midst of that back brain fight, flight, or freeze response. And so that individual is interacting with family members, and family members and friends are also going to be impacted directly or indirectly. They may surround the individual with support, or they may avoid and withdraw based on their own experiences, right? So the systems interacting can either mitigate or exacerbate the collective experience. Organizations like the school or the workplace of the individual who experienced the traumatic death of the loved one may or may not provide some support, and may or may not implement some preventative measures. Maybe it was a gun-related suicide death that this person had experienced, and the organization that they're going to, whether it's their school or workplace, may invest in educating everybody on suicide and suicide prevention and gun safety. And so it goes on to the community level. The community at large may or may not come together to support the victim and shine a light on the issue that they're facing. And same with society. Society at large may or may not create or implement just those big legislative changes that provide funding for large-scale research or treatment to address the problem. So remember, trauma is not just what happens to us, but what doesn't. And each part of the system is interacting with the other. So that individual can be supported in healing or re-traumatized each time they engage in the system. And to highlight some of this interaction between individuals and the larger long-term impacts within the system with untreated trauma, I want to look at the ACEs study. It is the Adverse Childhood. I'm going to skip this one because it kind of goes over what I just talked about. So the ACEs study is Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I've got a really short, well, it's 5 or 6 minutes, but this is such an important part of that whole trauma informed approach. So Valerie, will you give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if we have time? And I can skip it and you can post this and people can watch it, but.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, we have time.
Okay. So in this video, you'll begin to understand what the study was about and the information that we glean from it and how it is beginning to inform practices in the healthcare and system and including mental health. And if you'd like more information on this, like I said, this is a short video. The Center for Disease Control put together a multi-part free training that you can access on their website, but also on YouTube. So if this sparks an interest and you'd like more information, please reach out to those resources, and it's listed on our resource page. So let me play this.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation, and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, People of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
So that offers some pretty important information that we can take and make really actionable change with. A big part of this study allows us to look at changing our paradigm and shifting to the question, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Not what's wrong with an individual, a community, or society, but what happened and how do we intervene? How do we throw a wrench in the wheelhouse and prevent further trauma? And then how do we also go back and treat the trauma that already exists, so as those inevitable life changes come up, we are able to navigate them with more presence and a much calmer nervous system, which will impact our health outcomes for the better. Just bear with me, I'm having trouble moving on. Okay, so speaking of our nervous system, I've got these two slides to just illustrate, what is going on when we are in the midst of a perceived threat. Actually, I think, hold on, I apologize, I skipped a slide here. Just going back to flowing in from the ACEs, this photographer, Joe Quint, much like Moms Demand Action and Counselors for Change, really felt like we need to raise our awareness about the impact of what's going on around us. We, as humans, we become complacent. And so part of his project, It Takes Us, Stories of Gun Violence from Across America, was a photography documentary that's ongoing to this day. And really, he has pictures of people of all backgrounds with all different gun violent related losses, where they share their story. And you can see in the images that are so powerful, the body impact that trauma has. You can see it in the eyes of the women who have lost. And Bessel van der Kolk writes, after trauma, the world's experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in life. And this goes on in the short term, but it can also expand for years afterwards when we don't have the resources and support and treatment that could help mitigate some of that. And so in these faces of the people he photographs, each of us can see our own lives and our own stories, and it's not much different. And so I think it's important that we are being active about sharing those stories, because like I had said, that is part of shifting into traumatic growth. But you can see from the images that impact that it has, not only on our emotions, but our physical presence. So moving on to this, talking a little bit about the nervous system, because once we know what our brain and body are doing, then we're not as threatened by it. Our bodies and brains are wired to both connect and protect at all times, right? And when we're in what's called the window of tolerance, where we feel safe and calm and connected to the people around us, we're in this part of our brain where we can problem solve, make short and long-term goals, consider consequences. In that space, we're in a place of connection, We're engaged and open to the world. And under the surface, our brain's still scanning the environment for any perceived threats so that it could act accordingly in a split second. When we have experienced a single incident trauma or a lifetime of trauma, that balance gets shifted and there's more wiring for protection going on and less wiring for connection. And so when we get, and then as stressors come into that window of tolerance, we often get, thrown out of it. We're either going to be hyper aroused or hypo aroused. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a threat that is real in front of us. The brain can just pick up on something outside of consciousness and trigger this whole response, where if you're getting hyper aroused, you might feel a lot of energy surging through you. You might feel panic, fear, raging. There's an image of a volcano to remind you that hyper arousal is, that heightened state. You can see it. It may be defensiveness, irritability. You're in that fight or flight mode. And then we can also, when flooded, get hypo aroused. That's more of the freeze, shut down. That looks like an iceberg. You might feel numb, checked out. A lot of times in the midst of trauma, people can have a shared experience of, it was like I was outside my body looking in. I didn't even feel connected to it. You may have like just no emotion on your face, and here there's really a lack of energy. So knowing that we tend to, no matter what the stressor is, when we get dysregulated and stressed, we may go towards that hyperarousal or hypoarousal. We have some patterns, sometimes, lots of times as humans, we're doing both at any given time. It's not good or bad, but it's our body's way of protecting us. And so, you can see over with the bear and the meerkat, that fight or flight response, right? The bear is alert and it's gonna fight to protect that cub, where the meerkat has those lookouts. They send an alarm and everybody goes into their tunnel. So they're fleeing. And then you have the dog and the cat who are in that hypo-aroused state, where if I just freeze and stay here, you might not see me, I might calm you down. So those are some examples of that. The thing with trauma, because we're wired to protect, our brain is taking in a ton of information in a stressful experience. It's going to scan the environment and take in all of the information around us so that it can store it, and then scan the environment in the future so that we can prevent anything from happening again. So as soon as the perceived threat's recognized, then our brain kicks into gear and you can go into that hyper or hypo-arousal, but the perceived threat is meant to be the signal to get our body into action. So an example of this, let's say someone is in a car accident in the early morning hours of summer on a particular road during a particular time of year. Moving forward for days, weeks, months following, anytime any part of that trauma is experienced, whether through memories or actually being on that road or out in the car on a particular time of day, the body is going to kick it up into gear so that you can be alert and oriented and survive the threat. Usually, we're not spending every day in a real threat. So that's where the miswiring and firing comes. So what happens is you might have an intrusive memory, kicks your body into gear, and that's the first perceived threat, right? And then your heart's racing and you go, oh no, my heart's racing. So there's another perceived threat. And then you might say, oh no, I'm like having trouble breathing. There's another perceived threat. So what the initial cue in for your memory was to trigger the brain into that response, now we're registering more and more threats that aren't really threats. It's our body doing what it thinks it needs to do, and it doesn't really need to do it. So being able to say, take a pause, recognize that that is at work in any given moment, and say, there's that pattern of protection. So we're labeling it to make sense of it. So there's that pattern of protection. And I'm going to lean in. I notice my heart's racing and I'm having trouble breathing. That's just my body doing what it thinks it needs to do. And then I'm going to do something to ground myself, which is get here in the room right now, present. I'm here, I'm sitting on the chair, I'm talking with friends, I'm safe. So by being able to label that process that our brain does to protect us and kind of walk ourselves down, we can get back into that window of tolerance so that we can make an informed decision and understand what we can do next. So Tiffany is going to begin to cover some of the symptoms of trauma and the resources and support and things that you can do. And as we're beginning to cover the symptoms of trauma, I want you to keep this in mind. Those symptoms represent normal people with normal reactions to abnormal situations and circumstances. So Tiffany, you can.
Yes. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you everyone for taking the time this morning to be here. So Stephanie shared so much great and useful information, and I encourage you all to look in the chat feature so that you can get some of those resources, because that's a lot of information to digest. And so something that Stephanie mentioned that I really want you all to kind of let sit in you is that trauma is more than just what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what has happened to you. And so Stephanie was just speaking about the window of tolerance and what it looks like when you're outside of the window of tolerance, whether you're on the hyper aroused side or the hypo aroused side. And it being really important to recognize that our body is designed to help us to survive and be functional and adapt to our environment. And when we experience trauma, as Stephanie said, our brain then misperceives information and really traps us in a state of protective scanning and seeking out those threats in order to keep us safe, even when said threat is not an actual reality. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the symptoms of trauma. And so the symptoms can be broken down into emotional and physical and behavioral. And so emotional is how we feel effectively when we are after a trauma event. And so that is, you can feel depressed, you can have anxiety, you can feel just restless and on edge, like you're unable to relax and enjoy. And that is in that scanning phase where you're continuously looking and searching and seeking out for threats. You can't relax if you're looking for a threat. And so that emotional experience can cause you to just remain hypervigilant. What can make that more stronger and more intense is having those intrusive memories, having those flashbacks, having dreams, and really seeing threat at every turn and every corner. And so because emotionally we feel so out of sorts, that can then move us into a place where our physiological experiences, our sensations, what we are actually feeling in our body, then start to also become chaotic and unstable. And so those are those physical feelings. So heart palpitations, problems with your breathing. Maybe you can't take a deep breath, or you're breathing, but it feels like it's very shallow and you're not ever getting enough air. Maybe there's tightness in your chest, or it just feels like there's a weight on your chest. It could come out in other somatic ways, like unexplained headaches, stomach discomfort, sweating, irritability, all of these things that is just your body signaling to you something is amiss. And then there's that disconnect between feeling that in your body, but then looking around you and seeing no identifiable threat. It's as if a bear ran into the room, your body would absolutely know what to do to protect itself or get away from the bear. The problem is when your body feels like there's a bear in the room and there's not a bear. And so the brain can't quite understand, how do I respond to this? How do I release all of this energy when I don't see the threat? And so when you add that emotional experience with the physical experience, then it moves to the behavioral, because as humans, we are wired to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. We want to feel good and we don't want to feel bad. And so when we are feeling all those emotional experiences and those physiological sensations, those tend to feel uncomfortable. And so then our mind doesn't even have to be trained or taught to do this. We're going to automatically try to go to something that causes us to feel different. And so that's where we get into avoidance, that we start avoiding things that might remind us of our trauma, or we start avoiding places or conversations or persons that might cause us or trigger our bodies to have one of those reactions. And so as we begin avoiding, our world starts getting smaller, because I can't go to this place, which means I can't go to a place that's like that place that might remind me of that place. Or I can't speak about this topic because it makes me feel this way. So then I can't talk about this topic that might lead to this topic that might be similar to this topic. And our world just starts to get closed in. And with that closed in, we can't connect with people. It's hard for us to reach out. It's hard for us to let people in because we're in that protective mode. We've shut down and we're in the protect as opposed to the connect. And so behaviorally, you can see avoidance, you can see difficulties with concentration, because it's really hard to focus on a task at hand when you're having to scan the environment for threats consistently and constantly. And if you're not able to concentrate, not only on a task, you're probably having a hard time concentrating and connecting when you're interacting with people, meaning that you lack engagement in your relationships, you lack engagement with your work or with your children, because it's too much. It's too much to take in. And so we start shutting down, and when we have a buildup, then that can start to come out in other ways. And so we can become irritable. We can become, lashing out or aggressive. And then there might be the potential to engage in behaviors to try to decrease those feelings, which can lead us now to substance use. And so maybe now we're having more drinks than we typically would, or maybe we're eating more than we typically would, just to try to feel something different. And so as Stephanie said earlier, trauma doesn't occur in a vacuum, because once you've experienced a trauma and it affects you, it then affects the way you see the world. It affects the way you approach the world. It affects the way you show up in the world. And that is not something that goes away on its own. And so when you've experienced the trauma, it's so important to recognize that trauma responses are very subjective and unique to the person. But at the core of it, trauma reactions are the body and the mind responding the way it's supposed to something that should not have happened in the first place. And so when you've experienced a trauma, it really takes a great deal of effort to not get caught up in the shame and in the blame of yourself. And instead recognize that this is what my body is doing to try to protect me, and how do I retrain and reattune and rewire my brain and body so that what it is doing is actually moving me closer to protection and safety and not away from it. Can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
Sorry. So as was spoken about in the earlier slide, that because trauma doesn't occur in a vacuum, there's definitely things that we can do to try to help move from the traumatic reaction to the traumatic growth, and to a place of healing and really being able to feel more connected with ourselves and our body, as well as to the world around us. And so we've got the support systems. When a trauma happens, we tend to want to go inside. Again, a turtle that goes into its shell, but we are truly stronger together. And so being able to reach out and receive that support from others in our communities and our family, that's going to help us. That sense of connectedness is so powerful in helping people to process through and heal from trauma. And so it's asking for help. It's feeling maybe uncomfortable and maybe even feeling like it's a burden, because that is where the mind will take you, but then pushing through that and identifying, no, I need some other help, that I'm locked in my body right now and my body is telling me things that might not be helpful or might not be fully accurate. And so I need help from the outside to pull me out of that. So strong support systems, whether it's your family, your friends, faith-based communities, therapists or a counselor, support groups, and all of the above. So it's not pick one of these, it's really have all of it, because it takes a village to raise a kid, is what they say. Well, kids become adults, and so we still need to be a part of a village and a tribe. So having those strong support systems really help to protect us from those traumatic reactions and them becoming long-term. Early intervention, so responding and noticing and getting help sooner than later. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about diagnoses, but know that you could experience a traumatic event and a day, a week, or a month after feel totally okay. And then it might be 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 months later and you do not feel okay anymore. Still reach out, still get some support, still ask for help, and resist the urge to say, well, this is old news. This happened a year ago. I don't know why I'm still feeling this way, because trauma is timeless. Since it does get trapped in the body and it has that potential to get stuck with you, there's not this set amount of time that you have to have your trauma treated at this time, period. When you have those experiences, when you start having the discomfort, address it, acknowledge it, get the help. The earlier, the better. But if it's later, still do it. And then there's the healthy coping strategies. It's what you do when you feel that way. Again, as humans, we are designed to avoid pain and seek pleasure. We want to feel good more of the time than we feel bad. But when we're trying to feel good, we want to draw from skills that will have the least amount of consequences, that are not going to add to our stress, distress, or problems. And so we do want to feel different. We do want to regulate our bodies. And yes, you can absolutely do that by zoning out and binge watching Netflix and eating a bag of Lay's potato chips. You could do that. You will feel a little bit different after you do that. It might lead you down a path of other consequences. And so it's drawing from other options that can help us to feel better, help us to feel grounded, bring us back into our window of tolerance, but that don't add to our stress, distress, or our toxic stress or consequences. And so that can be relaxation, that is meditation, mindfulness, exercise and physical activity, eating food that actually nourishes our body, getting enough sleep. Sleep is very significant. It's one of the first things that gets disrupted when you're having a traumatic response, is your sleep. And so getting sufficient sleep helps your body to be recharged and be replenished to just take on the stress of the day. Having hobbies, using humor, and trying to focus on what's within your control and being able to take action. Empowerment and being able to be the author and the creator of your life is really going to help you to get through those difficult times and grow in that resiliency.
Okay. Oops, sorry, hold on.
So now we have some resources, and there are also many resources that are listed in the group chat, but we have the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and that is a 1-800 number that you can call and somebody will pick it up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you can just get some support through that. There's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, similar concept, specific to if you are struggling with or experiencing any type of intimate, personal partner violence, that you can call that. There's the text crisis line. So maybe you're not quite ready to have a verbal conversation, but you can send this text and somebody will be on the other end and will respond to you. 211 Brevard is here locally. You can go and you can dial that and get resources here that are specific to our area. There are other websites and trainings that you can go to and receive just to familiarize yourself with the effects of trauma, with the resources, with how to adopt healthier ways to cope and respond. And Given Hour, if you haven't heard of, is also another amazing resource where they offer complementary therapy to people who need it. And so Given Hour initially started to help military members, service members and their families and veterans that were experiencing some sort of trauma as it relates to their military service. And that had been their mission for a number of years. Well, following the Pulse tragedy and shooting in 2016, I believe, they expanded their services to support individuals who were survivors or had been affected by the Pulse shootings. And then from there, it expanded even further to respond and add support and give support to individuals who were affected by the Parkland and the Marjorie Stoneman shootings and just school shootings in general. And even more recently has expanded to provide services for health workers, frontline workers, essential workers that have been impacted by this COVID-19 pandemic. So Given Hour is a phenomenal resource as well for you to get that support. So we move from just identifying that support is needed, but actually taking action to get that support. There's also the Not Okay app, where you can download this app on your phone. You can pre-load persons from your contact, from your support system into this phone. And if you ever find yourself not doing okay, you can just push the button and it will automatically send a message to those people that you've identified to say, I'm not okay. So that then those individuals can be prompted to reach out to you. Because sometimes you're not doing okay, but you don't even have the words to say. You don't know where to start. That maybe you started to type a text to say you're not doing okay, but then you feel like, well, that person's busy, or I don't want to be a burden, or I don't want to be dramatic, or whatever the negative conversation loop is. You can just click the Not Okay button and it eliminates all of that. It sends a message, and then the persons that you've identified can respond. There's also the Lighthouse Project, Everytown Survivor Network. You guys are all familiar with Moms Demand Action, and then Change Direction, so that you can be aware of the signs of suicide, thoughts, and just mental health awareness and prevention.
Thanks, Tiffany. Valerie's going to go over a little bit more information about Everytown Survivor Network and Moms Demand Action. But before we do, I forgot about a really invaluable resource, HAP, the Humanitarian Assistance Program. It is a group of EMDR trained and certified therapists. EMDR is an approach to trauma that really just changes the direction of a person's life. I've been trained in it and have worked with clients, and it has profound, lasting effects on that ability to process the trauma adaptively and move into this space where you're back in your life, hopeful and energized for the future. And so HAP, like I said, is a group of those therapists, much like Given Hour, who go out and respond to a community crisis. So that's always a great resource to keep in mind. You can always contact Counselors for Change, or Valerie has information to get connected, but should somebody need that on a community level, that's a great organization. And Tiffany and I are working with Space Coast Mental Health Counselors Association to create a list of trauma-informed counselors so we know who to reach out to in the community. It's a different approach when you are counseling through a trauma-informed lens. So when you're reaching out, you want to be sure that there's some training involved in addressing trauma. And Valerie has a sheet for families, friends, that you can help assess and screen and provide resources for somebody who you think may be at risk for suicide. And anybody can do that. The Columbia Lighthouse Project also has free training on how to do that, what to say, how to say it, and how to seek action that anybody can access on their site. So some great resources out there for everybody to get trained in. So Valerie?
Yeah, thanks. So the last two resources on the slide, I just wanted to explain how Moms Demand Action and the Everytown Survivor Network work together. Everytown for Gun Safety is the parent organization over both of these separate entities. And Moms Demand Action, just in case there's someone maybe listening to this recording later who's unfamiliar, we are the arm that focuses on prevention of gun violence through advocacy and education. So we facilitate conversations like we did last week, where we had our police chief and some community leaders on the call. We call, write, visit our lawmakers. A lot of them know us by name. And that's at every level of government, because they make the decisions ultimately that impact public safety. And we rely on research to inform what we say. We tell them about policies that have been proven to make communities safer. When we find that they're not willing to act, we work to support candidates who will act. So we are nonpartisan, but we are political in that sense. Regarding education, last week we heard the Be Smart presentation about preventing kids from gaining access to guns. So information like that, we really try to get out into the community, and we work to educate the public about studies and facts and research to try to dispel some common myths around gun ownership, and things like only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun, and some of this kind of thinking that is really not based on facts. The Everytown Survivor Network, on the other hand, is a community, it's a national community of survivors of gun violence. And this is a point that I want to highlight especially, that it is really important. Part of coping is to build community with others who have been through a similar trauma and can understand because they've experienced it themselves. So if you've survived trauma, it's vital to connect with other people who also have. This doesn't mean that other people in your life can't help or that their support isn't important. There's just something powerful about being with others who really get it from a personal perspective. And that's really how Moms Demand Action and the Everytown Survivor Network come together. Because when a survivor makes it to a point that they want to reach out, they want to make a change, and there are many ways that they can do that, then they can connect with us. So I kind of serve as a person who sends people to the network, and then the network will sometimes send people back to moms. So you might want to join moms, advocate, become an educator and advocate to prevent this from happening to others. You might also feel that you want to join the network and help other people to deal with their loss and their trauma. I will just say Moms Demand Action needs survivors, because as a survivor, you have a unique perspective on this cause. So we need your leadership to kind of lend that to us. Not that anyone owes us anything, but you're vital and you're important to what we are trying to do. We need you in leadership roles. And we have so much work to do that whatever you're good at, whatever you're passionate about, we can use it. we are not many people trying to do big stuff, so we need everyone. And also the network provides training if you want to one day share your story, or you feel that you need someone to back you up and help you to get to that point. My last point about the Everytown Survivor Network, which I think is fabulous, maybe the best thing that we do, is that they are able to fund free mental health counseling for you if you're a member of the network. And it costs nothing to be a member of the network. It is purely a resource. It takes none of your time, and it costs nothing. But as a member, you are entitled to counseling through BetterHelp, which is super convenient now. That's an entirely online counseling service. So you can video chat, you can talk on the phone, you can even just text a counselor, whatever you need. And the Everytown Survivor Network will pick up that bill. So it's fantastic. If you are interested in that, you can contact me after, or my email is in the chat, or I'm going to send a follow-up email. So you will know how to get in touch with me if you're interested. And that's all I have about those two resources. Do we have another slide, or are we?
This is it. We want to leave you with this. Compassion is even more powerful than courage. Sure, with courage, you can conquer a world, but only with compassion can you heal and build it. And being in a collective, compassionate space is where change and healing happens. And like you and Tiffany were saying, that support system's vital. You know, the research shows that over and over again, more than genetics, more than the trauma you've experienced, the connections that you reach out to and seek and support are the largest determining factor of your emotional well-being and your long-term health and longevity. So we're happy to be a part of today with everybody else who's joining us, and look forward to collaborating in the future.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you.
Do we have questions or comments from anyone? I'm happy to open the floor up at this point.